There was a marvelous woman who gave a very interesting eulogy for her very best friend. She had been asked to speak, and she said later that as she was planning to put all of these thoughts together, all of these stories she could tell about her dear friend's life, all of the memories she shared with her, the good times and the tough times, the funny things that happened, she said she didn't know how she could ever try to package that all up on the day of the service. And she was giving it a lot of thought, and she came early to the service. She said she took a seat up in the front of the chapel that day. She had a lot of notes on her lap, things she was going to try to share. And then she had a very interesting observation. She said just as they invited her to come to the front to speak, this thought popped into her mind, and she thought it was good enough for her dear friend that day, that stories she had could wait. There would be plenty of time to share all of those. But this one short, I guess we could call it a marvelous little eulogy, 16, 17 words is all it ended up being, seemed for her to sum up her dear friend's life. And as I was hearing all of the stories about Marion's life, all kinds of things, and then as I said, looking through those marvelous picture books, I thought of what this woman said, because there's an old kind of belief, this is just a little tie-in now, that when you go up to heaven, you know a big screen's going to drop just like that. And God's going to say, here's your life. Well, I got to thinking for Marion, it would be very easy for God. He'd just come down here, snatch up 20 or 30 of those books. There must be a lot more. I can't imagine that's everything, being in the business. There must be an awful lot of really marvelous things, like I said at the beginning. It was such a good thing. It's always so good to see people honoring those memories with pictures, because pictures, unlike words, they don't lie. There it is, you know, smiles, tears, tough times, it's all there. And so this woman came up to the front of the chapel, and she turned, and this was her reflection for her friend. All she said was this. She said, she came into this world crying, while all those stood around her smiling. She went out of this world smiling, while all those stood around her crying. And I thought, you know, if not on Marion's face when she left this world, if it is true that our whole life is going to be flashed there before us, if even part of those marvelous pictures are what God was showing Marion about her life, and then having heard so much more, because the one thing that kept coming up through a good many year parts of her life was the word laughter, I've got to think that if not on her face, deep in her soul, as Marion passed on, she must have gone out of this world with a huge, huge smile on her face. And I didn't hear a lot of details about Marion's life, but that's always okay. I find if I get too many details about somebody, it just confuses me anyway. But I heard so many different things, and we laughed on the phone the other day. We were talking about she could be kind of cantankerous and other parts of her life. You know, she was all kinds of things I was reading. I'm going to share some of these reflections that came from some friends, and it was just so obvious in there that laughter was a part of her life. The Italian, now there's a big thing. Italian's big. I always said my first assignment in Elkhart, Indiana, was in an it wasn't an Italian parish, but it was 80% Italian, so the other 20% were old grumps, but the Italians were good. And I always said there were the 5 F's with the Italians: food, fun, family, faith, and friends. And it was just true. All of them. They had this sense of life. And it always got tied in with the food and with the fun, with the friends, certainly with the family, and absolutely with the faith. And it all came together in their sharing around a table, meals, and laughter, and stories. Actually, I think I learned more eating lunch every Sunday for 5 years with the Lucchese clan than I learned my whole life before about life. because of the Italian background there. And it really was obvious that was a big thing. Marion had little special words. I couldn't even figure some of them out, even trying to read them. I was trying to, how do you pronounce that now? But I do know good old Cheech, he was the head guy of the patriarch of this whole Lucchese clan in Elkhart. Oh, he used to sit and tell stories, and he would use these words too. He'd just call somebody something, and I'd go, oh, I don't know if that's good or not, but if it was any of the young kids and they weren't acting too good, they started acting good real fast. And in Marion's life, as I was thinking through all the things I was told about her life and what I had read and then looking at those marvelous pictures, I got to thinking, well, where could we go in the scriptures today to find something for Marion? Well, there were a lot of places. I always like to do just one scripture reading. I think there's always something there, although I may have to refer to another one or two for Marion because it was such an interesting story of her life. But I thought right away of Luke's gospel. I thought, we got to go to Luke's gospel. Luke's gospel is the gospel of the women. And there's an interesting thing in Luke's gospel. Unlike Mark and Matthew and John, Luke includes all these special stories of Jesus encountering women in all kinds of different things, in poverty, in pain, in joy. He begins his gospel with Martha and Mary and the joy of the Annunciation. He ends his gospel with the women at the tomb. By the time you get to John's gospel, John's kicked the women out, and he has Peter and John there. I think it was the women. I think John, remember, in John's gospel outruns Peter. All this macho stuff. It just destroys the beauty of these gospels. But in this story, of all the stories in Luke's gospel, this one little story of the widow of Nain just seemed to pop right out. It's a very simple story, doesn't take up more than a few verses. But Luke says, as Jesus walked along, he saw a funeral procession. And you got to say, well, Jesus probably saw maybe hundreds of funeral processions. When somebody died at the time of Christ, they would have to prepare the body immediately and bury it before sundown, part of the Jewish tradition. So he must have seen all kinds of these funeral processions as he walked along. But Luke goes on to kind of dig us a little bit, because he's writing this with, I think, a little bit of a smile on his own face. And he said, it was a young man who died, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. And then I think with a real grin he said, a large crowd of people was with her. That's the kicker to the story. A large crowd of people was with her. Jesus must have seen many large crowds of people taking the dead to the place of burial. Why was this so different this day? Why was this one funeral? We don't hear of any others in all of the Gospels. We hear of Jesus going to his friend Lazarus and Jairus' daughter, but this was out of the blue. He wasn't summoned to this resurrection event. Why was this one so different? And the answer has everything to do with Marion and her life. The large crowd of people that was with this woman, this wonderful widowed mother, would have been, according to the tradition of the Jews at the time, all male. See, women weren't allowed to go to the places of burial. It would make them unclean. So when somebody would die, as this widow mother had just done, she prepared her own son's body for burial, probably with the help of other friends. But when the men then picked up that body to start out on the journey to that cemetery, to that place of burial, only one woman stood up. This wonderful widowed mother. The men would have looked at her and said, oh God, she did this with her husband. And they would have pushed her to the back. This was unheard of. You don't break these strong Jewish traditions. And they went out the door, and there at the back of the procession was that one loving mother, sharing the qualities that all of the women in Luke's gospel share. She was a mother of deep faith, of extreme love, and total commitment to her family. And there she walked. And